She glanced down at Mary Alice. Bring up your tap shoes. My tap shoes? Mary Alice clutched her head, which she often did these days. Grandma, I haven't taken tap since I was a kid. Give it up, did you? Grandma said. Ages ago, Mary Alice sniffed. I'm taking ballroom dancing now, so to get ready for high school mixers and formal and semi-formal evenings. Grandma pondered, fingering her chins. Then she said to me, Find my gum boots. We're going to high grass and tall timber. Take us the better part of the day to get there and back on Shank's ponies, which meant we'd be walking. When I didn't find her gum boots in the cellar, she sent me to the Cobb house. As I passed through the kitchen, I noticed Grandma and Mary Alice had their heads together, conspiring. The only light in the Cobb house came from the open door, but I could see the phantom brakeman's old overcoat hanging on a peg. Under it stood Grandma's gum boots. When I reached down for them, a boot moved. Remembering cottonmouths, I recoiled. My hands were in my armpits when I heard a sound. One of the boots mewed. I'd forgotten about the old tomcat, but then he'd have jumped at me by now if he'd been around. A kitten's face appeared out of the top of the boot. Pointy ears, whiskers, big green eyes. She mewed at me again and tried to get a paw up, and I reached down for her. She was gray with a white bib and boots. She only weighed ounces, and she kept her claws in when I tucked her in my arm, and she carried her back to the house with the gum boots. In the kitchen, Grandma had her gardening hat on, with the chigger veil. She was packing our lunch with a couple of early tomatoes and some salt for them in a twist of paper. I drew nigh and planted the kitten on the table beside her. Get that thing out of the house, she barked. But neither the kitten nor I was fooled. The kitten butted Grandma's hand. Then she rubbed herself along Grandma's arm, and Grandma led her. Got a new pet? I inquired. Chicago people have pets, she said, but there's a new litter living down in the Cobb house now, and I let 'em. They keep down the vermin. Don't need all of them, though. Gently, she lifted the kitten and put her in the hamper with our lunch. We'll drown this one on the crick on the way, she said. But I wasn't worried. What happened to the old tomcat? I asked, meaning the jumping Tom. Got in front of the cannonball, Grandma said briefly. She was sitting to tug her gumboots on now, and she was already wearing men's pants under apron and dress. Grandma, are we going to see Aunt Puss Chapman? I said, trying to see a little bit ahead. We're going further out in the sticks than that, she said, grunting. What for? To see if an old feller named of Uncle Grady Griswold's still living, and his wife Aunt May. By now I knew that not everybody around was called uncle or aunt was necessarily your uncle or aunt. Why do we want to know? Because if he's alive, Uncle Grady'd be 103 years old. The sun had already begun to punish us by the time we'd crossed the bridge over Salt Creek. I was carrying the hamper, and mews came from within. Grandma had forgotten to drown the kitten. We walked a long way over roads we'd skimmed in the Terraplane 8. Mary Alice wasn't with us. She was elsewhere. Mary Alice was up to something. By noon, we were nearly out in the county. We'd crossed Route 36, but Grandma trudged on. We ate our lunch in a pasture. The kitten climbed out and fed from our hands. Then she stalked around in the weeds, teaching herself to jump at butterflies. When it was time to go, she climbed back into the hamper. We cut across the fields from there to a little house at the end of the faint lane. Somebody still lived there. Chickens were in the brooder house, and the garden was in and weeded. Hollyhocks stood guard along the fence. Grandma pushed open the front door. It was a parlor from some other time with faded love knots on the wallpaper. Beside a cold stove sat an old lady. On the other side, in a rocker, sat the oldest man on earth in a stocking cap. Grandma sighed with satisfaction to see them both breathing. Aunt May Griswold grinned at Grandma. Both her teeth gleamed in the gloom of the room. How you been, Aunt May? Oh, yes, Aunt May agreed. Very warm for the time of year. She wore gardening gloves and a variety of shawls. How are your feet? Grandma thundered at her. Are they still swelling on you? Not bad, Aunt May said. They're still pretty good layers. We get 8 or 10 dozen eggs off them every day, and we sell what we don't eat to the cowgills. Grandma turned to Uncle Grady. Speak right up to him, Aunt May called out. He's a little hard of hearing. Uncle Grady Griswold was almost as small as he was old. The pom-pom on his stocking cap hung far down his humped shoulder. He was so old he'd have made Aunt Puss Chapman look like a young girl at her first party. He gazed, uninterested, up at Grandma. "How you been, Uncle Grady?" she said, speaking up. "Fair to piddling," he said weakly. Grandma lifted the kitten out of the hamper by the scruff of its neck. "I brought you a mouser." Uncle Grady blinked at the hanging kitten and seemed to rally. "Put her right here," he said, and Grandma lowered the kitten into his bony lap where she offered her head for petting. "Do you get up and around, Uncle Grady?" "Oh, yes," he said in a stronger voice. "I wrung the neck off a chicken this morning before daylight." "Did you have chicken for your dinner?" "No." He shook his head. "She got away." "Ah," Grandma said. "Listen, Uncle Grady, do you still have your old army uniform?" He started, and the kitten looked up in alarm. He waved two small, shriveled fists. "Has war been declared?" He'd have jumped out of his chair, ready to enlist, but Grandma put a hand on him. "Nothing like that," she said. "Well, I'm ready," he piped up. "I'm cocked and primed. My full kit's in the bedroom there." He pointed a crooked finger. "We sleep downstairs now because May can't climb steps. She's getting on in years." Grandma nodded me toward the bedroom. "Don't forget my sword," Uncle Grady called after me, seeming not to wonder who I was. Aunt May looked on, interested. I found his full kit: uniform, sword, boots, and spurs, and a cap. They didn't smell very good, and they didn't look right to me. "Grandma," I muttered, holding up the small coat, "there's something funny about this uniform. The only Civil War uniform I'd ever seen up close was on Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach's daddy. Was Uncle Grady on our side?" "Of course he was on our side," she said, "but he goes back before the Civil War. He was in the Mexican War." "They winged me at the Battle of Cerro Gordo," Uncle Grady offered. I stared. "Grandma, we'd covered the Mexican War in school that year." "Grandma, the Mexican War started almost 90 years ago. Even if Uncle Grady is 103, he'd only have been about my age during the war." "Well, maybe he was a little drummer boy," Grandma suggested. "Rum-tum-tum," Uncle Grady said, playing on an imaginary drum with imaginary drumsticks. Grandma turned to the other rocker. "Can I borrow Uncle Grady for the day on Saturday, Aunt May?" she howled. "You sure can, honey," Aunt May said. "In fact, you can keep him." She'd heard every word and grinned broadly. On the first day of the centennial celebration, the town began to fill up with merrymakers and curious. People came in farm wagons and Fords from as far away as Bement and Tuscola. Grandma closed all her windows because the dust from the road never settled. People came for the events, the tree topping and chicken plucking competitions, and the chili cook-off. They marveled at the flower show put on by the ladies of the United Brethren Church, and the mother-daughter look-alike contest, the spelling bee, the Illinois Power and Light Company's display on rural electrification, and the three-legged race. I hadn't seen hide nor hoof mark of Mary Alice all day. That evening, Grandma and I had a quiet supper at the kitchen table under the ceiling light and the flypaper strips. This was the night of the talent show. I knew we were going, even after she poured a second cup of coffee and stifled a yawn like she was thinking of bed. "I guess you'll want to go look in on the show," she remarked. But I was 15 now, and I was wise to her. I stifled a yawn. "Doesn't matter to me. We don't have to stay to the end." She was on her feet now, making short walk of the dishes. The stage was the bandstand in the park, lit with headlights running off car batteries. We chose a back bench because nobody wanted to sit behind Grandma, and we could see everybody from here. The audience was mostly town people because the farmers had all gone home to do their chores. But there was a good turnout. Mrs. and Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach were up in the front row. On a table by the bandstand waited a loving cup for the first prize and scrolls for second, third, and honorable mention. Just as the crowd was getting restless, the first act began. A man playing a musical saw. Grandma sat through that with both hands clamped on her feet. Afterward, she remarked that it had been more saw than music. Then we had a barbershop quartet, though they called themselves the Sons of the Prairie Pioneers and all wore beards. They were Mr. Earl T. Askew and 3 more of the sheriff's deputies. Patient practice had improved them some, and they didn't sing The Night That Patty Murphy Died in mixed company. They did a medley that included Just a Song at Twilight, and after a round of applause, came back for Sweet Adeline. Grandma wasn't about to clap for deputies. She began to fidget. The local part of the program continued with the choir for Mrs. Effie Wilcox's church. They did Sweet Hour of Prayer, The Old Rugged Cross, and then I Come to the Garden Alone when the dew is still on the roses. These got no response from the United Brethren members, but the choir returned for an encore anyway with tambourines to sing. Swing low, sweet chariot, and scoop me from the mire. Take me up to glory, snatched from eternal fire. If I hadn't known better, I'd have thought Grandma was ready to leave. She was fidgeting all over the bench. Then a boy clumped on the stage. He was about 5th grade or an overgrown 4th. His hair was parted in the middle, and he'd painted artificial freckles all over his moon face. His costume was high-top shoes and old-time breeches held up by one suspender. "That's my nephew, everybody," Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach called out from the front row. He cleared his throat and began to recite. "Ain't I glad I ain't a girl, hands to wash and hair to curl, skirts a flappin' round my knees. Ain't I glad that ain't me." The boy planted his fists on his pudgy hips and looked out over the audience. "Grandpa says it's just a chance that I got to wearing pants. Says that when a kid is small, they put dresses on 'em all. They that kicks and makes a noise gets promoted into boys. Them that sits and twists their curls, they just leaves them, calls them girls." He took his bow to a spatter of applause that grew. All of Mrs. Weidenbach's friends stood to clap, and they were joined by everybody who owed the bank money. The boy kept bowing. "That about made me half sick," Grandma remarked. At this point, we could have used an intermission, but Mrs. Merle Stubbs of the Ladies' Committee mounted the stage carrying a portable Victrola. She threw wide in its doors and wound it. "Crank it up, Lula," someone called out, and the crowd tittered. Mrs. Stubbs dropped a record on the turntable and withdrew. They'd have dimmed the lights now, but only the car batteries were weakening anyway. Music from a full orchestra welled out of the Victrola. It was a waltz. "When I grow too old to dream, I'll have you to remember." From nowhere, a couple glided onto the bandstand stage. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and seemed to be wearing a tuxedo. In his big hands, he held a girl, the vision of a girl. Headlights caught the glimmer of her white gown as he twirled her in easy circles. Her graceful hand held up her flowing skirts. The crowd caught its breath. It was like a movie coming to life. The seed pearls on the girl's dress flashed pale fire. I looked again, and behind the careful makeup, below the swooped-up hair, it was Mary Alice. As she turned in the waltz, the bustle came into view. I nudged Grandma hard, but she was completely caught up in the sight of Mary Alice sweeping around the stage in Grandma's own wedding gown. But who was her partner? He was dipping her almost to the floor now, though you couldn't tell who was leading who. I squinted and saw that it was Ray Veach. Ray Veach of Veach's Gas and Oil, and wearing Grandpa Dowdle's wedding suit with the cuffs let all the way down. Ray Veach, a man's man who spent his life under cars with grease up to his elbows. Ray Veach and Mary Alice. My world tilted. Now the waltz was winding down. Ray and Mary Alice came out even with it. Still clinging to one of the big hands, she collapsed to the floor in an elegant curtsy. Her skirts fanned out in every direction. After a moment of stunned silence, the crowd was on its feet. They were getting up on their benches and clapping over their heads in applause like summer thunder. Grandma stood, patting her back hair in a satisfied way. She said, "We don't need to stay to the end."